"Sir, this seat isn't going to work out for you. I need you to gather your things." Malik Coleman looked up from his book, certain he had misheard. Boots. The flight attendant standing over him wasn't asking. She was informing him the way you'd inform a child that recess was over. Boots. He was 17 years old, sitting in seat 2A, a window seat he had chosen himself 3 weeks earlier when he booked the ticket with his own money. Boots. He was wearing a plain gray hoodie, dark jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days. A paperback sat open on his lap, and tucked inside its pages, worn soft at the corners from years of handling, was a photograph of a woman with his same wide smile. Boots. "I'm sorry," Malik said slowly. "Is there a problem with my ticket?" "There's a problem with where you're sitting," the woman said, and something in the way she said it made 3 passengers nearby lower their phones and start paying attention. Boots. Her name tag read DeWitt Fald. She would come to regret, more than almost anything else in her 22 years of flying, that she had said those words with a boarding cabin full of witnesses. Boots. But she didn't know that yet. In that moment, she believed she was doing exactly what the job required of her. Boots. She had no idea whose son she was talking to, and in less than an hour she would find out in the worst possible way. Boots. This is the story of a flight that never should have taken off the way it did, and the reckoning that followed for everyone who chose to look away. Boots. The morning had started like any other for Malik. He'd woken up at his father's townhouse in the Elmwood Park neighborhood of Charlotte, North Carolina, packed a single carry-on, and eaten cereal standing at the kitchen counter, while his father, Robert Coleman, read something on his phone with a particular stillness he reserved for legal briefs. Boots. "You've got everything?" "Passport, laptop, the acceptance letter printed out in case they ask," Robert had asked, not looking up. Boots. "Dad, it's a coding fellowship, not a border crossing. Humor me." Malik was headed to San Francisco for an 8-week software engineering fellowship at a firm that had, 3 months earlier, flown him out for a final interview and offered him a spot alongside 11 other students selected from a pool of nearly 4,000 applicants. Boots. It was the kind of opportunity that could change the shape of a life, and both of them knew it, even if neither said so directly. Boots. Robert Coleman was not a man who said things directly when a look would do. He was a senior litigation partner at Coleman, Reyes & Frost, a mid-sized firm with an outsized reputation for taking on civil rights cases that larger firms wouldn't touch. Boots. 14 years earlier, when Malik was 3, Robert's wife, Malik's mother Denise, had died of an aggressive cancer that gave the family 11 months of warning and no mercy at all. Boots. Robert had raised his son alone since, building a career that let him work from home 2 days a week and never, not once, miss a school function. Boots. He rarely spoke about Denise, but he kept a photograph of her in his wallet, and he had given a duplicate to Malik on his 13th birthday, folded into the pages of Denise's favorite novel, the same paperback Malik still carried, its spine cracked from being read a dozen times over. Boots. At the gate that morning, Robert had placed a hand on his son's shoulder, the closest thing to an embrace the man allowed himself in public. Boots. "Call me when you land," he said. "I always do. Not always. Sometimes you text." "I'll call," Malik said, and for a moment something flickered across his father's face. Pride, maybe, or the particular ache of watching a child step into a version of the world you can't follow him into. Boots. Then it was gone, and Robert nodded once, and Malik walked down the jet bridge toward BlueHorizon Airlines Flight 884, nonstop to San Francisco, boarding at Piedmont International Airport. Boots. He had no way of knowing that in less than 90 minutes, his father would be standing at that same gate again, and the entire aircraft would not move an inch until he arrived. Boots. Diane Whitfield had been flying for Blue Horizon for 22 years. She was 51 years old, with a blonde bob she wore pinned back with military precision, and a voice that could shift from warm to clipped in the space of half a sentence. Boots. Colleagues described her, depending on who you asked, as either a consummate professional who ran a tight cabin or someone who made junior flight attendants dread being scheduled with her. Boots. Both descriptions were, in their own way, accurate. She had grown up in a small town outside Greensboro, where her father ran a hardware store and made no secret of his opinions about who belonged where. Boots. Diane would have said, if you'd asked her directly, that she wasn't like him, that she treated every passenger the same, that she was simply thorough, careful, attentive to detail in a way the airline should be grateful for. Boots. She believed this sincerely. That was, in the end, the most dangerous thing about her. She noticed Malik the moment he boarded, before he'd even found his row. Boots. Young, alone. A hoodie instead of the blazers and quarter zips the rest of first class favored. Seat 2A, full fare, purchased 3 weeks in advance, the same fare paid by the businessman in 2C, who was already 3 emails into his morning and hadn't looked up once. Boots. Her eyes moved over Malik the way a metal detector moves over a stranger at security, and something inside her, an alarm she had learned to trust over 2 decades, though it had never once been triggered by a young white passenger in the same seat, began, quietly, to ring. Boots. Can I see your boarding pass, hon? Malik handed it over without comment. He'd learned over years of flying with his father that the fastest way through moments like this was compliance, not argument. Boots. Diane studied it longer than the document required, turned it over as if checking for a watermark, then handed it back with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Boots. You're in the right place, she said in a tone that suggested. She found this mildly surprising. Malik said nothing. Boots. He opened his book. Inside the front cover, the photograph of his mother sat exactly where it always did, and he pressed the pages flat against his knee and tried to disappear into the words. Boots. It didn't work. Diane found reasons to return to his row 3 times in the next 20 minutes, to check his tray table, which was already stowed. Boots. To remind him, unprompted, that his backpack needed to be properly secured, though it was zipped and settled beneath the seat in front of him exactly as required. Boots. To ask, with a smile sharpened into something closer to a blade, whether he was traveling with an adult. He was 17. Boots. The airline's own policy required no such thing for a passenger his age flying alone, and she knew it. She asked anyway. Boots. On her 3rd pass, she paused at his row a beat too long, glanced at the paperback in his lap, and said, loudly enough for the row behind him to hear, You know, we do have a children's activity kit, if you'd like something to look at instead. Boots. Malik said nothing. He simply held up the book so she could see the cover. A dense literary science fiction novel, not the sort of thing that needed a cartoon substitute, and watched something flicker across her face that might have been embarrassment if she'd allowed herself to feel it. Boots. She didn't apologize. She moved on to the next row, offering the same passengers a genuinely warm, unhurried smile, as though she'd simply run out of patience for the interruption and nothing more. Boots. Each question was small. Each one, alone, could be explained away as diligence. Together they formed something else entirely, a pattern that the businessman in 2C had begun, almost against his will, to notice. Boots. His name was Aaron Whitcomb, and he flew this route for work nearly every other week, which meant he'd flown with Diane Whitfield before, more than once, and had never once seen her circle back to a passenger's row 3 times over nothing. Boots. He didn't say anything, not yet. He would think about that silence for a long time afterward. 2 rows up, a woman named Carla Jennings, traveling home from a work conference, caught Malik's eye once, gave him a small, sympathetic, almost smile, and then looked back down at her phone. Boots. She told herself later she hadn't wanted to make it worse by getting involved. She would replay that decision for months. Boots. Pay attention to the paperback in Malik's lap. It will matter again before this story ends. The final boarding call came and went. Boots. The cabin door was sealed, and that was when Diane Whitfield made the decision that would end her career. She approached Malik's row with a folded printout in her hand, and an expression arranged into something that looked, if you weren't paying close attention, almost like concern. Boots. Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me. There's a discrepancy with your reservation. A discrepancy, Malik repeated. Boots. His stomach dropped, but his voice stayed level, a skill his father had drilled into him without ever quite explaining why. Boots. What kind of discrepancy? I paid for this seat myself. I have the confirmation email right here. I understand that's what you believe, Diane said, and the word believe did something to the air in the cabin. A small poison dropped into water. Boots. But our system is flagging an issue, and I need you to step off the aircraft so we can sort it out at the gate. Boots. We're about to push back, which is exactly why we need to move quickly. Heads were turning now. A woman 2 rows up lowered her magazine. Boots. The businessman in 2C set down his phone entirely, watching with an expression that had shifted from mild curiosity into something more uncomfortable. Boots. Can I at least know what the discrepancy is? Malik asked, reaching for his phone to pull up his confirmation email. Boots. I have the reservation right here, with a confirmation number. If something's wrong in your system, I can help you fix it faster than pulling me off the plane. Boots. That's not how this works, sir, Diane said, and the word sir had curdled somewhere between the first time she'd used it, and now no longer a courtesy but something closer to a warning label. Boots. I need you to stand up. Aaron Whitcomb, 3 seats over, finally set down his laptop entirely. Is there actually a problem with the manifest? Boots. He asked, not loudly, but clearly enough that Diane's eyes cut toward him for half a second before returning to Malik. Boots. Because I've flown this route a dozen times, and I've never seen a seating discrepancy get flagged after boarding's already complete. Boots. Sir, this doesn't concern you. There's no discrepancy, Malik said, and for the first time his voice rose, not loud but no longer soft either. Boots. I checked in myself. I have the pass right here. This is my seat. Sir, I need you not to raise your voice. Boots. I'm not raising my. If you continue to be uncooperative, Diane said, and her tone dropped into something quiet and final, I'll have no choice but to treat this as a disruptive passenger situation, and that's a very different conversation. Boots. One that involves airport police. The threat landed exactly as she intended it to. Boots. Malik felt the eyes of the entire cabin on him. Pity from some, curiosity from others, and from at least one older man across the aisle, a flicker of something worse. The silent assumption that a 17-year-old black boy being pulled off a plane must, on some level, have done something to deserve it. Boots. Nobody said a word in his defense. Nobody moved. He closed his book carefully, the photograph of his mother still tucked inside, and stood up. Boots. His hands were not shaking. He would not give her that. Fine, he said. Let's sort it out. The walk up the aisle felt longer than the length of the aircraft should have allowed. Boots. Diane walked half a step behind him, radiating a kind of quiet satisfaction she would later swear to anyone who asked that she never felt. Boots. In the jet bridge, a gate agent named Trevor Banks was waiting, radio in hand, looking like a man who had been told very little and asked to handle a great deal. Boots. He was 26, 3 years into the job, still new enough to believe that most conflicts could be solved with a calm voice and a printed itinerary. Boots. I'm sure this is just a mix-up, Trevor said. Let's get you sorted at the desk. Malik wasn't listening anymore. Boots. He pulled out his phone and dialed the one number he had memorized, since he was old enough to memorize anything. Boots. Who are you calling? Trevor asked, a note of nervousness creeping into his voice that hadn't been there a moment before. Boots. My dad. It rang twice. Malik, you should be in the air by now. Dad. His voice cracked on the word 17 years old, suddenly collapsing back down to something much younger. Boots. They pulled me off the plane. There was a silence on the other end that lasted just long enough to be frightening. Boots. Say that again, Robert Coleman said. His voice hadn't risen. It had gone the opposite direction, flattened, slowed, each word placed with the precision of a man laying bricks. Boots. Malik explained, the words tumbling out faster than he intended. The questions about his backpack, the comment about traveling with an adult, the sudden discrepancy that appeared the moment the door was sealed, the threat of airport police. Boots. Trevor stood beside him, close enough to hear every word, his face draining of color in real time. Diane stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching with an expression that hadn't yet caught up to what was happening. Boots. Where are you right now? Robert said. A coordinate he needed. Gate C-19. Piedmont International. Give the phone to whoever pulled you off that aircraft. Boots. Malik held it out. Trevor took it like it might detonate. This is Trevor Banks, gate agent for Blue Horizon. Boots. Banks, my name is Robert Coleman. I am an attorney. Boots. I am also the father of the 17-year-old you just walked off a fully paid, fully confirmed first-class seat in front of an entire cabin of passengers, for reasons that appear, based on what my son has just told me, to have nothing to do with any actual discrepancy, and everything to do with the fact that a black teenager in a hoodie made your flight attendant uncomfortable. Boots. Sir, we're just trying to verify. You have 30 seconds to tell me one specific documented reason my son's reservation was flagged. Boots. Not a feeling, not a hunch. A reason with a record attached to it. The silence on Trevor's end answered the question before he said a word. Boots. That's what I thought, Robert said. Here is what happens next. My son is going back to seat 2A. The flight attendant who removed him is going to give him a genuine, specific apology in front of every passenger who witnessed what she did to him. Not a scripted non-apology, an actual acknowledgement of what occurred. Boots. If she is unwilling or unable to do that, she does not fly today. And that aircraft does not move from the gate until I have personally confirmed my son has been treated the way a paying passenger is entitled to be treated. Boots. I am 9 minutes from the terminal. I suggest you use that time wisely. Sir, we can't just hold an aircraft. Boots. You can, and given what I do for a living, I promise you that you will find a way. Trevor's hand was visibly trembling when he passed the phone back. Boots. Behind him, another agent picked up a ringing desk phone, listened for a few seconds with her eyes widening, and turned toward Trevor with an expression somewhere between alarm and disbelief. Boots. Trevor. Operations just called. They're holding 884 at the gate. Legal's orders. Diane Whitfield's arms uncrossed slowly. For the first time since she'd walked up to seat 2A with her folded printout, something like doubt crossed her face. Boots. The plane was grounded. Not because of weather, not because of mechanical failure, but because one father had made one phone call, and the drama at gate C-19 was only just beginning. Boots. The atmosphere at gate C-19 had curdled into something thick and anxious. Boots. The overhead announcement citing a brief operational delay had come and gone twice, and the passengers still seated on Flight 884 were growing restless in a way that had nothing to do with the delay itself, and everything to do with the tension radiating up through the jet bridge, a tension you could feel even without knowing its cause. Boots. Trevor Banks paced a 6-foot stretch of carpet with his radio pressed to his ear, listening to voices that kept escalating in urgency. Boots. Diane Whitfield stood near the podium with her arms crossed again, though the posture had lost its earlier confidence. Now it looked less like authority, and more like a woman bracing for impact. Boots. Malik sat in a hard plastic gate chair, his book closed in his lap, his thumb running along the worn edge of the cover the way it always did when he needed something steady to hold on to. Boots. Beside him, unexpectedly, sat Aaron Whitcomb, who had asked to deplane along with the small cluster of passengers curious enough to follow the commotion off the aircraft. Boots. You don't have to sit here, Malik said, not unkindly. I know, Aaron said. I wanted to say something back there and I didn't. Boots. Sitting here is the least I can do. He didn't say much else. He just stayed, a quiet, unasked-for presence, until Robert arrived. The kind of small gesture that changes nothing about what already happened, and yet somehow makes the next 10 minutes easier to survive. Boots. He hadn't asked for any of this. He hadn't wanted a grounded plane or a scene or an audience. He had wanted a window seat and 8 quiet hours to read before starting the most important summer of his life. Boots. But the machine that had been set in motion the moment Diane Whitfield decided a black teenager in a hoodie didn't belong in 2A could not be stopped now, and some small, tired part of him was almost grateful. Boots. Almost. Robert Coleman arrived 9 minutes after he said he would, not a second later. He moved through the terminal the way he moved through a courtroom, unhurried, precise, radiating the specific kind of authority that doesn't need volume to be felt. Boots. He was 52 years old, dressed in the gray suit he'd been wearing, when Malik left him at security that morning, and when he reached the gate, he didn't look at Trevor first. Boots. He looked at his son. He crossed the distance in 4 strides and put a hand on Malik's shoulder, checking him over the way you check a child after a car accident, cataloging that he was upright, that he was breathing, that he was, in every physical sense, unharmed. Boots. Then, and only then, he turned to face the gate. Mr. Banks. Trevor practically snapped to attention. Mr. Coleman, sir. Boots. We've held the flight like you asked. Good. Now let's talk about Ms. Whitfield. He turned to Diane. Boots. She flinched, almost imperceptibly, as if his gaze carried physical weight. My son tells me you removed him from a seat he legally occupied, after a pattern of what he describes as targeted, demeaning treatment, and that when he objected, you threatened to have him arrested. Boots. Is that an accurate summary? I believe there was an issue with the seating manifest, Diane said, her voice smaller than it had been an hour earlier, but still holding its shape. Boots. I was following procedure. What procedure specifically involves asking a 17-year-old whether he's traveling with an adult, when airline policy has no such requirement for passengers his age? Boots. What procedure involves flagging a fully confirmed, fully paid reservation the moment the cabin door closes, with no documented discrepancy attached to it? Boots. Walk me through the procedure, Ms. Whitfield. I have a law degree and 20 years of experience picking apart exactly this kind of explanation, so please take your time. Boots. Diane opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She looked at Trevor, who suddenly found something fascinating in the carpet. He seemed, she started, then stopped herself. Boots. He seemed what? The silence stretched long enough that everyone standing near the gate, the second agent, a mother waiting with 2 small children for a different flight, a maintenance worker who had paused mid-stride to watch, understood exactly what word she wasn't willing to say out loud. Boots. Out of place, she finally said, barely above a whisper. Out of place, Robert repeated, and something in his voice went very quiet and very cold. Boots. In first class. In a seat he paid for himself. What precisely made him seem out of place to you? Boots. His age? His clothing? Or was it something else entirely, Ms. Whitfield? Something you're having a much harder time saying out loud. Boots. I have flown for this airline for 22 years, Diane said, her voice climbing now, defensive in a way that had nothing to do with an actual defense. Boots. I have never once had a complaint like this. I know how to read a cabin. I know when something feels off. Boots. Something felt off, Robert repeated slowly, about a 17-year-old with a book and a boarding pass. 22 years, and that's the instinct you're standing behind. Boots. I was doing my job the way I've always done it. That, Robert said, is exactly what worries me. Nobody answered after that. Boots. Nobody needed to. That was the frozen moment. For 3 full seconds, nothing moved at gate C-19. Trevor stopped pacing. Boots. The mother with the 2 children stopped murmuring to them. Even the announcements over the terminal speakers seemed, for that stretch of silence, to hold their breath. Boots. The only sound was the low mechanical hum of the jet bridge and the small, sharp intake of air Diane Whitfield took before she looked away from Robert Coleman's face, unable to hold his gaze any longer. Boots. A woman in a BlueHorizon blazer, several shades sharper than Trevor's, hurried down the jet bridge, phone still pressed to her ear, finishing a call before she reached them. Boots. This was Renee Ashford, the station manager for Piedmont International, a 20-year airline veteran who had clearly been informed of exactly how bad this situation had already become. Boots. Mr. Coleman? She extended a hand. Renee Ashford, station manager. I came as soon as I was notified. I want to personally apologize for what your son has experienced today. Boots. This is absolutely not how Blue Horizon operates, and I intend to. A misunderstanding is a coffee order that comes out wrong, Robert said, cutting through her prepared language without raising his voice. Boots. This is not a misunderstanding. My son was profiled, harassed, and publicly removed from an aircraft in front of 40 other passengers, and the flight attendant responsible has just confirmed, in her own words, that she did it because he seemed out of place. Boots. I need you to understand that I am not interested in an upgrade, and I am not interested in a scripted apology written by your legal department 6 months from now. Boots. I am interested in accountability today in front of the people who watched it happen. Of course, Renee said, though something tightened behind her eyes. Boots. Malik is welcome back on the flight immediately, and we can absolutely discuss. He will return to seat 2A, Robert said. Boots. Ms. Whitfield will offer him a real apology in the cabin, in front of the passengers who witnessed his removal. Boots. If she cannot do that honestly, she does not fly today. Renee turned to Diane. Diane, is that something you're prepared to do? Boots. Diane's jaw tightened. For a moment, something almost like a genuine reckoning flickered across her face. A crack in 22 years of certainty. Boots. Then, just as quickly, it sealed back over. I was doing my job, she said. I don't think it's fair to characterize 22 years of professional conduct based on one. Boots. One what? Robert said quietly. Finish the sentence, Ms. Whitfield. She didn't finish it. She couldn't. Boots. That refusal, that inability even now, with a grounded aircraft and a furious father and a station manager standing 3 feet away, to simply say, I made a mistake and I'm sorry, would turn out to be the single most consequential decision of her career. Boots. Because Renee Ashford, watching Diane search for a version of events where she hadn't done anything wrong, made a decision of her own. Boots. Diane, I need your badge. You're being relieved from this flight, effective immediately, pending a full review. You can't be serious. Boots. Over one complaint? It's not one complaint, Renee said, and something in her voice had gone tired in a way that suggested this was not, in fact, the first time Diane Whitfield's name had crossed her desk. Boots. It's the fourth in 14 months. I let the first 3 go because there was no video, no third party, nothing but your word against a passenger's. Boots. Today there were 40 witnesses and a recorded gate call to operations. I can't let it go this time, I won't. Boots. Something shifted in the air. The businessman from 2C, who had followed the commotion off the plane, along with several curious passengers, exchanged a look with the woman who'd lowered her magazine earlier. Boots. Neither of them said anything, but both of them, for the rest of the day, would replay the moment they'd watched a teenager get walked off an aircraft and said nothing, and both of them would carry that small, private discomfort home with them, a discomfort that had no name but felt uncomfortably, like guilt. Boots. Malik stood at the edge of it all, holding his book, watching a woman who 20 minutes earlier had held enormous, casual power over him lose all of it in real time. Boots. He expected to feel triumphant. Instead, he felt strangely hollow, as if watching Diane Whitfield's world collapse couldn't undo the 20 minutes in which his own dignity had been treated as optional. Boots. He would think about that hollowness for a long time afterward. It taught him something his father's legal victories never quite could. That consequences, even fully deserved ones, don't erase harm. Boots. They just make room for something better to grow in its place, eventually, if you're patient enough to wait for it. Boots. Renee Ashford crouched slightly in front of him before he reboarded, meeting him at eye level rather than looking down. Boots. I can't undo what happened to you this morning, she said, but I can promise you it gets looked at, all the way up, not just today and then forgotten by next week. Boots. Malik nodded. He didn't fully believe her yet. It would take the better part of a year, and a great deal of Robert's persistence before he did. Boots. But that was a lesson for later. Right now there was a plane to catch, and 40 passengers waiting to see how the story ended. Boots. Word had spread through the cabin the way it always does. Not through any announcement, but through the particular electricity of 40 strangers who all sensed, correctly, that something significant had happened just beyond the door they couldn't see through. Boots. When Malik walked back down the aisle toward 2A, flanked by Renee Ashford and trailed by his father, the cabin went quiet in a way that felt less like curiosity now and more like reckoning. Boots. Renee stood at the front of first class and addressed the cabin directly, her voice steady despite what it must have cost her. Boots. On behalf of BlueHorizon Airlines, I want to sincerely apologize to Mr. Coleman and to all of you for what took place today. Boots. A passenger was removed from his confirmed seat without cause, and that is not acceptable under any circumstance. We take this seriously, and it is being addressed. Boots. It wasn't Diane's apology. Diane never gave one. Not that day. Not standing in front of the cabin, not in the version of events she would go on to tell friends and family for months afterward, in which she remained, in her own retelling, a conscientious professional caught in an unfair pile-on. Boots. She was escorted off the aircraft through the forward galley, avoiding the eyes of the very passengers she'd once commanded with a look, and she did not look back at Malik once. Boots. He noticed. He would think about that, too, for a long time, the fact that even in total defeat, she couldn't manage to face him. Boots. It told him something true about the shape of her regret, that it existed somewhere, but it wasn't yet regret for what she'd done to him. Boots. It was regret for what had been taken from her because of what she'd done to him. Those were not the same thing, and it would take Diane Whitfield the better part of a year to understand the difference. Boots. The captain, a woman named Elena Marsh with 26 years of flying behind her and a voice that carried easily without a microphone, came back to greet Malik personally before pushback, an unusual gesture, but not one anyone in that cabin was inclined to question. Boots. Mr. Coleman, she said, extending a hand. I'm sorry this happened on my aircraft. It won't happen again. Not on my watch. Boots. Malik shook her hand. Thank you, Captain. You handled that better than most adults would have, she added quietly, before turning back toward the flight deck. Boots. It wasn't a large gesture, but it landed exactly where it needed to. His father lingered a moment longer than boarding protocol technically allowed, crouching slightly beside the seat. Boots. You good? I'm good, Dad. You don't have to be good. You can be angry. You're allowed. Malik almost smiled. Boots. I know. I think I used it all up already. Robert studied his son's face for a long moment, the same face that carried Denise's eyes, the same stubborn set to the jaw that Robert saw in the mirror every morning, and something passed between them that didn't need words. Boots. He squeezed Malik's shoulder once, turned, and walked back up the aisle toward the exit, already pulling out his phone to make the first of what would become dozens of calls in the following weeks. Boots. Flight 884 pushed back 41 minutes behind schedule. Malik opened his book, Somewhere Over Tennessee. The photograph of his mother settled against the crease of the spine exactly where it always sat, and for the first time since boarding, he let himself simply breathe. Boots. The following months unfolded with a kind of grinding, unglamorous inevitability that Robert Coleman understood better than almost anyone. Boots. He filed a formal complaint with the airline within 48 hours, and a broader civil rights complaint 2 weeks after that. Once it became clear Blue Horizon's internal review intended to quietly settle the matter with an apology letter and a travel voucher. Boots. Robert did not want a voucher, he wanted the pattern. It didn't take his firm's investigators long to find it. Boots. Diane Whitfield's personnel file, once subpoenaed, revealed 3 prior complaints in the preceding 14 months. A Latino family accused, without basis, of exceeding a carry-on limit that applied equally to every passenger around them. Boots. An elderly Filipino man asked twice to confirm a first-class boarding pass that a white passenger 2 rows away was never asked to produce. Boots. A college student, visibly disabled, denied early boarding assistance until another crew member intervened. None of the 3 had escalated the way Malik's had. Boots. None of them had a father, who was a civil rights litigator with the resources and the resolve to make sure a 4th complaint became impossible to bury. Boots. Robert flew to Sacramento himself to sit across from the college student, now a sophomore studying architecture, and listened to her describe being left at the jet bridge door for 11 minutes, while Diane radioed for clarification that never came. Boots. He drove 2 hours outside Charlotte to meet the Filipino man, a retired postal worker named Ernesto Villarreal, who still had the boarding pass Diane had asked him to produce twice, folded into his wallet the way some men keep a lottery ticket they never cashed. Not for luck, but as proof that something unfair had actually happened and he hadn't imagined it. Boots. Each conversation added a brick to the wall Robert was building, and each one he made a point of telling his son mattered on its own, independent of Malik's case entirely. Boots. Their stories don't need mine to be true, he told Malik one evening at the kitchen counter. Mine just happened to be the one loud enough to make people finally listen to all 4. Boots. The story reached local news within a week, national outlets within 3. Boots. Blue Horizon's stock dipped 2.5% the day the footage, captured, it turned out, by the businessman from seat 2C, who had quietly recorded audio on his phone the moment Diane approached Malik with her folded printout, was picked up by a national morning show. Boots. His name was Aaron Whitcomb, and when a reporter later asked him why he hadn't said anything in the moment, he gave an answer that stuck with a great many people who heard it. Boots. I told myself it wasn't my place to get involved, he said. But I recorded it anyway, because some part of me knew that not saying anything and doing absolutely nothing were 2 different kinds of wrong, and I could only live with myself if I did the smaller one. Boots. Blue Horizon's leadership, facing a lawsuit that Robert Coleman had structured with surgical precision, discrimination, defamation, negligent supervision, each claim reinforcing the others, chose to settle rather than let a jury hear 4 documented incidents from a single flight attendant read aloud in open court. Boots. The settlement was substantial, though Robert never disclosed the figure publicly. What he insisted on instead, as a condition of resolution, was structural. Boots. Blue Horizon agreed to a full external audit of discrimination complaints across its entire route network for the preceding 3 years. Boots. It agreed to overhaul its complaint tracking system so that patterns like Diane Whitfield's could no longer hide across 14 months of scattered, unconnected reports. Boots. It agreed to mandatory, ongoing bias training developed with outside civil rights consultants. Not a single afternoon seminar, but a recurring program built into annual recertification for every customer-facing employee. Boots. And it agreed to publish an annual transparency report on discrimination complaints and their outcomes, reviewed by an independent oversight board that included, at Robert's insistence, a permanent seat for a civil rights attorney unaffiliated with the airline. Boots. The audit, once completed, was worse than even Robert had anticipated. Boots. Across 3 years and 11 regional hubs, investigators found 47 substantiated complaints of discriminatory treatment that had never been escalated on a passenger's individual file. Never cross-referenced, never connected to a single employee's broader pattern, quietly settled with vouchers and apology letters, and then forgotten. Boots. Blue Horizon's CEO, a man named Gerald Ashcombe, who had spent his first public statement on the matter carefully avoiding the word discrimination in favor of the vaguer isolated incident, stood in front of a very different set of cameras 6 weeks later and used the actual word 4 times in 11 minutes. Boots. It cost the company nearly $31 million in settlements, legal fees, and lost bookings in the 2 quarters that followed. Boots. Gerald Ashcombe would later say, in an interview he didn't have to give, that the hardest part of the whole ordeal wasn't the financial cost. It was reading 47 files in a single weekend and realizing how long his own company had been choosing not to look. Boots. Renee Ashford, whose swift decision at the gate had likely saved Blue Horizon from an even larger legal exposure, was promoted 8 months later to a director-level role overseeing the very compliance program born out of that day. Boots. She kept, on her office wall, a printed copy of the flight manifest from Blue Horizon 884. Not as a trophy, she told a colleague once, but as a reminder of the day she'd chosen to believe 40 witnesses over one employee's 22 years of seniority, and what it had cost the company not to have made that choice years earlier. Boots. Trevor Banks stayed with the airline. He requested, unprompted, to be part of the first cohort trained under the new program, and became, within 2 years, one of its most requested facilitators for new hires. A young man who told his own story honestly in every session, including the parts where he'd said nothing and simply passed the phone. Boots. And Diane Whitfield lost everything the airline could take from her. Her employment was terminated within a month of the internal review's conclusion, the 4th substantiated complaint against her making any other outcome legally indefensible. Boots. Her pension, 22 years in the building, was gutted by the terms of her termination. She spent the better part of a year unemployed before taking a position at a retail counter in a strip mall outside Greensboro, folding sweaters for customers who had no idea they were being served by a woman who had once, briefly, made national news. Boots. She did not for a long time understand why any of it had happened to her. Boots. She told herself, in the early months, that she had been made an example of, that political correctness had cost her a career built on decades of genuine hard work, that the story had been exaggerated, that Malik Coleman had a powerful father, and she hadn't had anyone in her corner at all. Boots. She said versions of this to her sister, to old coworkers who still returned her calls, to a therapist she started seeing 11 months in, mostly at her sister's insistence. Boots. It was the therapist who finally asked her a question Diane didn't have a ready answer for. If a white teenager in a hoodie had been sitting in 2A that morning, would you have approached him the same way? Boots. Diane sat with that question for 3 full sessions before she could say, out loud, the word no. It didn't undo anything. Boots. It didn't get her job back, or her pension, or the 22 years she'd built a professional identity around. But it was, her therapist told her gently, the beginning of something. Not forgiveness, not from Malik, not from herself, but understanding, which had to come first. Boots. Her sister, the only family member who still called regularly, asked her once, gently, whether she'd ever consider writing to Malik directly. Not to ask for anything, just to say the words she'd never managed at the gate. Boots. Diane started the letter 3 times. Each draft ended up in the trash. Not because the words were wrong, but because some old, stubborn part of her still flinched at putting apologize for profiling a child on paper, as though the sentence itself might finish what the termination had started. Boots. She kept the 4th draft. She has not sent it yet. Her therapist says that's all right, that some letters exist to change the person writing them long before they're ever meant to be read by anyone else. Boots. Nearly a year after that morning at Gate Scene Teen, Diane saw Captain Elena Marsh across a grocery store parking lot outside Charlotte. Boots. Their eyes met for a moment. Elena didn't say anything cruel. She didn't say anything at all. Just a small, level nod, neither warm nor cold, the kind of acknowledgement you give a stranger whose story you happen to know. Boots. Diane got in her car and sat there for 11 minutes before she could bring herself to drive. Malik started his fellowship in San Francisco 8 days late, having stayed in Charlotte through the first wave of media attention at his father's gentle insistence, though Robert never once suggested Malik use any of it for his own advantage. Boots. Malik finished the program at the top of his cohort. 2 years later, he was accepted into MIT's computer science program, and the acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday that his father, uncharacteristically, took off work entirely to celebrate. Boots. He still flies more than most 17-year-olds ever did before that day. He still gets, on certain flights, a flicker of something tightening in his chest when a flight attendant's eyes linger a half-second too long on his boarding pass. Boots. He always screenshots his confirmation now, just in case. Boots. And he still carries the same paperback, its cover more worn than ever, the photograph of his mother, tucked exactly where it has always been. Not because he needs reminding of what happened on Flight 884, but because some things you carry with you not out of fear, but because they remind you who you're becoming, and who helped get you there. Boots. Robert Coleman still tells the story of that morning in guest lectures on civil rights litigation, though he leaves Malik's name out of it now, referring to him only as my client. A small, deliberate act of protection for a son who has already given the world more than enough of his story. Boots. He ends every lecture the same way, with a line he first said to Malik in the car, on the drive home from Piedmont International that evening, once the rebooked flight had finally landed, and the two of them sat together in the driveway, neither quite ready to go inside. Boots. Being right isn't the same as being safe, he'd told his son. You were right that morning. You were still made to feel small. Boots. Don't let anyone tell you those two things cancel each other out. Malik has never forgotten it. He keeps it, in a way, the same place he keeps everything that matters most, folded quietly into something ordinary, carried without needing to be seen. Boots. And somewhere in Charlotte, behind a retail counter, a woman still thinks about a 17-year-old boy with a paperback book and a photograph tucked inside it, and about the 22 years she spent believing she knew, at a glance, exactly who belonged in seat 2A and who didn't. Boots. She was wrong. It cost her everything, and in whatever quiet, unglamorous way regret finally settles into a person who spent decades refusing to feel it, she has at last begun to understand why. Boots. If this story stayed with you, not because of how it ended, but because you recognize someone in it, maybe even a version of yourself in one of the silent witnesses, take a moment to like it, so it reaches someone who needs to hear it today. Boots. Share it with someone who's ever been made to feel like they didn't belong somewhere they had every right to be. Boots. And tell me in the comments, have you ever stood in a room like that one, and which side of it were you on? I read every single answer.